My husband mocked my career. He never knew I owned the company he worked for. So last year at our neighborhood barbecue, my husband, Daniel, stood up in front of everyone, raised his beer, and said, "My wife's the sweetest accountant you'll ever meet. She makes just enough to cover my golf trips." Everyone laughed. I didn't. I just smiled, like I always do when I'm dying a little inside. You know that kind of smile, the polite one that hides everything you wish you could say out loud. We lived in this small Oregon town where everyone knows everyone's business. People there judge you by your house, your car, and how perfectly you smile at church on Sunday. And me, I was the quiet wife, the one who baked cookies for bake sales and handled the books for a few local shops. Nobody ever asked what I really did. They just assumed I wasn't doing much. What they didn't know was that I could balance million-dollar portfolios in my sleep. But sure, let them think I'm just Dan's sweet little helper. It was easier that way. Sometimes I'd overhear the guys from his company talk about me. "Rachel's got a good thing going," they'd say. "She married up." I'd be in the kitchen refilling their chips, pretending not to hear. I still remember the day Daniel's boss came over for dinner. His name was Greg. Loud, arrogant, the kind of man who thinks every woman owes him a smile. After dessert, he patted my shoulder and said, "You must be proud of your husband. He's got real potential, unlike some people who just handle receipts." Daniel laughed. I laughed too, but it sounded hollow even to me. That night, while I was washing dishes, Daniel came up behind me and said, "Don't take it so seriously, Rach. Greg's just joking." I asked quietly, "Do you think he's right?" He hesitated, just a second, but that second told me everything. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just wiped my hands, turned off the faucet, and said, "Okay." That was it. One word. But inside something shifted. I decided right then I'd never try to prove myself to him, or anyone, ever again. I'd let the truth do that for me when the time came. What Daniel didn't know, what no one in that barbecue, or at church, or in his office knew, was that I owned something far bigger than his fragile pride could ever imagine. And one day, they'd all find out. You ever have one of those weeks where life feels like a bad sitcom that forgot to be funny? That was me, right after that barbecue. Daniel started staying late at work. "Networking," he said. And I started noticing how he'd change shirts before leaving, spray too much cologne, and delete texts a little too quickly. I wasn't stupid. I just didn't say anything. You learn that in small-town marriages, silence can be armor. Every night after he left, I'd sit at my old wooden desk, the one my dad built for me when I graduated college, and dive into my real work. Not the local bookkeeping everyone thought I did, but the investment firm I co-owned with my best friend, Grace. We called it R&M Financial Group. She handled contracts, I handled numbers. Together, we quietly turned struggling businesses into million-dollar turnarounds. No one in town had a clue. Not even Daniel. He thought I was just balancing grocery receipts. It's funny, right? A man will drive a truck he can't afford, brag about his title, and still have no idea his wife signs off on the budget that keeps his company running. The irony practically writes itself. Grace once told me, "Don't tell him, Rach. Men like him get real weird when they realize you don't need them." She wasn't wrong. Daniel was already pulling away, throwing backhanded compliments like darts. "You're lucky I'm the ambitious one," he'd say. "You don't like taking risks." I'd just smile and reply, "You're right, I prefer calculated ones." He never caught the joke. Still, it stung. Not because I needed his validation, but because I once cared so much about having it. I remember one night he came home drunk from some office party. He flopped on the couch and mumbled, "Greg says I'm on track to be regional manager next year. Big things coming, babe." Then in the same breath he added, "Maybe when that happens you can finally quit that little bookkeeping thing." That little bookkeeping thing. I swear that phrase echoed in my head for days. I didn't yell. I didn't even roll my eyes. I just made a mental note. He has no idea who he's talking to. See, here's the twist. 2 months before that, my firm had quietly purchased 30 of the shares in Northwood Construction, the very company Daniel worked for. Meaning, when his paycheck came in every month, technically, I was one of the people approving it. It was poetic in a way. The man who kept telling me to aim higher was unknowingly working for me. Grace and I had done it strategically. We knew Northwood had potential but poor management. I'd studied their finances for months, hidden behind a fake consulting name so no one could trace it back to me. The irony? Daniel once vented to me about that mystery investor who was changing everything. I just smiled and asked, "Sounds like they know what they're doing, huh?" He laughed and said, "Yeah, but they'll never understand what it's like to be in the field." I almost choked on my coffee. The more he bragged, the more I learned how deep his arrogance ran. But I didn't hate him, not yet. There was still a small part of me that hoped he'd see me one day for who I truly was, not just as the woman behind his grocery lists. Then came the night that changed everything. We were at a dinner party thrown by his boss, Greg, the same guy who once called me a receipt handler. Everyone was drinking, laughing, talking about promotions. And in the middle of it, Greg slapped Daniel on the back and said, "You've got potential, son. You keep this up. Maybe one day you'll meet the real investors, the people who actually run things." Everyone laughed. Everyone but me. I just sipped my wine, looked Greg dead in the eye, and said quietly, "Maybe you already have." The whole table went silent for half a second. Daniel chuckled awkwardly, trying to play it off. "She's just joking," he said, but I wasn't. And something in Greg's eyes told me he knew it. That night, on the drive home, Daniel was fuming. "What was that about?" he snapped. I looked out the window and said, "Just conversation." He gripped the steering wheel so hard I thought it'd crack. "Don't embarrass me like that again," he muttered. I didn't respond. Because the truth is, I wasn't embarrassed. For the first time in a long time, he was. When we got home, he slammed the door and went to bed without saying goodnight. I stayed up in the kitchen, pouring myself another glass of wine. And as I watched the reflection of the porch light dance on the glass, I realized something. This wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about reclaiming a piece of myself I'd buried under all that quiet. He thought I was invisible. He thought I was small. But the thing about people who underestimate you is that they never see it coming when you rise. And, I was just getting started. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Funny how life can flip on a Tuesday. Not a big day, not dramatic like a Friday or a birthday. Just Tuesday. I was making coffee when Daniel walked into the kitchen in his usual rush, tie half done, phone glued to his hand. "Big day, Rach," he said, grinning. "Meeting with the new investors. Finally, people who understand real business." I smiled, biting my tongue. He didn't know I was one of those people. He left with a kiss on the cheek and a scent of too much aftershave, the same cologne he used when he wanted to look important. I watched him pull out of the driveway and thought, he's about to walk into a meeting run by me, and he doesn't even know it. The meeting was at 10 a.m. in Portland, and I joined via Zoom from my home office. I kept my camera off, let Grace do the talking. She was brilliant, sharp, professional, lethal in a calm way. When Daniel introduced himself, I swear I could hear the arrogance through the screen. He talked about his vision, about leading the team forward, completely unaware that the person approving the budget he bragged about was sitting in pajama pants drinking coffee 2 hours away. When it ended, Grace texted me, "He just pitched us a project we already own." I laughed so hard I almost spit out my drink. But things took a turn that evening. Daniel came home unusually quiet. He poured himself a drink. Not beer, whiskey, neat. That was his "I'm in trouble" drink. I asked, "Long day?" He shrugged. "Investors are tougher than I thought. That Grace woman, cold as steel." I just nodded. "She's good at her job." He didn't catch the weight of that sentence. 3 days later, everything unraveled. I was in the kitchen again when his phone started ringing nonstop. He was in the shower, and after the third call, I picked up. "Hello?" A panicked male voice shouted. "Mr. Miller, we've got a serious problem. The investors—" He paused. "Wait, who is this?" "His wife," I said. "Rachel Miller." The man hesitated, then blurted, "Ma'am, you need to tell your husband to call me right now. The new financial documents came through and this can't be right. The majority shareholder of Northwood Construction is listed as R&M Holdings, owned by you." I froze, staring at the steaming coffee in my hand. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Could you repeat that?" He did. And at that exact moment, Daniel turned off the shower. I could hear him humming some country song, completely oblivious that his entire ego was about to implode. When he came out, towel around his waist, I handed him the phone. "It's your lawyer," I said. He looked confused but took it. As the lawyer repeated what he'd just told me, I watched Daniel's expression change. Confusion, disbelief, then panic. "That's impossible," he said. "My wife's just an accountant." He turned toward me, dripping water onto the floor. "Rach, what did you do?" I met his eyes, calm as ever. "Nothing you didn't already know. You just never asked. He stood there, silent, gripping the phone like it could save him. You bought my company? He finally stammered. I shrugged. Technically, I bought into it. Your boss needed funding, and I provided it. Simple math. You lied to me, he shouted. You've been pretending. Pretending? I interrupted. No, Daniel, I've been surviving your version of marriage. The silence that followed was heavy. You could hear the tick of the clock, the slow drip of water from his hair hitting the tile. He sank into a chair, muttering, You embarrassed me, in front of everyone. I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because that's all he cared about. Not love, not honesty, not the years I spent holding him up, just pride. He grabbed his keys, stormed out, and didn't come back that night. I sat on the couch, sipping my coffee, staring at the dark window reflection. My hands were steady, my heart wasn't racing, it was almost peaceful. I'd imagined this moment before, but it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance, the numbers finally adding up. The next morning, Grace called. He found out, huh? She said. I chuckled softly. You could say that? She laughed. I wish I could have seen his face. I smiled, picturing it clearly. Yeah, I said. It was priceless. And just like that, years of quiet endurance finally paid off. Not in rage or tears, but in a single, undeniable truth. He'd spent our whole marriage underestimating me. And now, he finally knew what that costs. The morning after it all blew up, the house was quiet. Too quiet. You know that kind of silence that feels heavier than noise? That's what it was. Daniel's car was gone. His side of the closet looked empty except for one wrinkled shirt hanging on the wrong hanger. No note, no message, just absence. I made coffee anyway, out of habit. But when I poured it into 2 mugs, I stopped halfway, stared at his, and thought, why am I still doing this? Then I poured it down the sink. Grace showed up later that day, holding a paper bag of muffins from the cafe downtown. She never said, I told you so. She didn't have to. She just sat there across from me, quietly peeling the wrapper off a blueberry muffin and said, You okay? I told her, Yeah, actually, I'm fine. And for once, I meant it. Over the next few weeks, the town caught wind of what happened. Small towns always do. People started whispering at the grocery store, pretending not to look when I walked by. One woman from church, sweet old Mrs. Carson, leaned in one Sunday and whispered, You did what needed to be done, dear. I smiled politely, but inside I was tired of everyone turning my private life into local entertainment. Then came the call I didn't expect. It was from Linda, Daniel's mother. She sounded softer than I remembered. Rachel, she said, I don't know what's true anymore, but my son, he's not doing well. He lost his job. I sat there silent, letting her words hang in the air. He said you embarrassed him, she added, her voice trembling. I exhaled slowly and said, No, Linda, he embarrassed himself. I just stopped cleaning up his mess. There was a long pause before she said quietly, You always were the strong one. A few weeks later, I heard Daniel was working at his uncle's auto shop in Bend, fixing engines instead of running projects. Part of me thought that was poetic. For the first time, he'd have to build something real with his own hands. Grace called when she found out. He's at a garage now, she asked, almost laughing. You couldn't make that up if you tried. I chuckled. Nope. Life's got a wicked sense of humor. I wasn't angry anymore. Just detached. Like watching a movie I'd already seen too many times. I'd spent so many years measuring my worth by how much space I took up in his life. Whether he was proud of me, whether I was enough. Now I realized I didn't need his validation. I had my own name on things that mattered. One Saturday, I drove out to the coast, Cannon Beach, my favorite spot since college. It was gray and windy, but peaceful. I sat on a bench overlooking the water, eating fries from a paper bag, and thought about how much had changed. Not just the marriage, but me. There was a time I would have blamed myself, begged him to understand me, tried to fix things that weren't mine to fix. But now, I didn't owe anyone that kind of pain again. When I got home, there was a small package on my porch. Inside was a simple note in Daniel's handwriting. You were right about everything. I'm sorry. No excuses, no promises, just that. I held it for a long time, feeling this strange mix of sadness and peace. I didn't forgive him right away, but for the first time, I could imagine it, someday. By the end of that year, Grace and I opened a new branch of our firm in Portland. She joked that I was becoming the silent shark of Oregon. I told her, more like a shark in a cardigan. We laughed, and she raised her coffee cup. To quiet power, she said. I still keep that note from Daniel in my desk drawer. Not as a reminder of what he did, but of what I survived, and who I became because of it. People think revenge is about payback, but it's not. The best revenge is peace. And mine came the moment I realized I didn't have to prove anything to anyone ever again. Now, every time I drive past the old house, I don't feel bitterness. I just think, that's where I stopped being small, and I keep driving. It's been almost a year since everything fell apart. Or maybe I should say, since everything finally fell into place. I still wake up early every morning, but now I don't rush to make anyone else's coffee. I make mine slow, strong, and exactly how I like it. There's something peaceful about those few quiet minutes before the world wakes up. It used to feel lonely, now it feels like freedom. Sometimes I drive past Northwood's old office on my way to the city. They've remodeled the building, new paint, new sign. But every time I see it, I remember the woman who used to sit in the parking lot waiting for her husband to finish just one more meeting. That version of me feels like a stranger now. She was kind, patient, but too willing to shrink herself so someone else could shine. I still love her, though. She's the reason I got here. The firm's Portland branch is doing better than I ever imagined. Grace and I built something real, something that's ours. We have clients who trust us, employees who look up to us, and Friday nights where we drink wine in the office, laughing about how two women from small towns ended up running one of the fastest-growing firms in the state. Grace always toasts first. To women who play dumb until it's time to collect the data. That line never gets old. Every once in a while, I'll get a text from someone back home. Usually it's something like, saw your name in the business journal, or didn't know you were that Rachel Miller. I just reply with a smiley face and go back to whatever I was doing. I don't owe explanations anymore. Let them think what they want. The people who laughed at me learned something I hope they never forget. That quiet doesn't mean weak, and kindness doesn't mean blind. And Daniel, the last I heard, he's managing a small auto shop now. I drove through Bend a few months back and saw him by chance. He didn't see me, but I saw him, older, humbler, maybe even lighter somehow. He looked human. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger or pity, just peace. Maybe we both got what we needed. I learned to stand tall, and he learned what it costs to take someone's light for granted. Last week, my mom came to visit. She asked me, "Do you ever regret it? Walking away, all of it?" I thought for a long time before answering. "No," I said, "I regret not leaving sooner." She smiled, the kind of smile that says you finally got it. That night, we sat on the balcony watching the city lights. I told her how I used to dream of being enough for someone. Good enough, smart enough, quiet enough. And she said something I'll never forget. "Honey, you were never too much. They were just too little." I laughed, but it hit deep. Maybe that's what all this was about. Learning that being underestimated can be a gift, if you know how to turn it into fuel. Because when people write you off, they stop watching, and that's when you rise. So yeah, maybe I didn't get the fairy tale ending I once pictured, but I got something better: peace, self-respect, and a story I can tell without bitterness. Sometimes I still catch myself thinking, if only he knew who he was married to. But then I smile, take another sip of coffee, and remind myself, he does now. And as the sun comes up over Portland, painting the skyline gold, I whisper the same words I told Grace the night we signed our first big deal. We made it out, and we didn't have to burn the world down to do it. That's the thing about quiet women. The world never sees them coming, until it's too late. You know, looking back, I think what this whole story taught me wasn't really about revenge. It was about reclaiming my own voice. For years, I stayed quiet because I thought peace meant avoiding conflict. But silence can be its own kind of prison, especially when it's built to protect someone else's ego. It took me losing everything I thought defined me, my marriage, my reputation, my comfort, to realize I hadn't lost the one thing that truly mattered, myself. We live in a world that still tells women to be small, to smile through disrespect, to settle for less, to make themselves easier to love. But here's the truth. You don't owe anyone your silence, your softness, or your self-worth. Real love, real respect, doesn't ask you to disappear. And sometimes, walking away isn't giving up. It's standing tall, Like they say, the cream always rises to the top. You just have to stop letting other people stir the pot. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel invisible, remember this. Gold doesn't lose its shine just because someone else is too blind to see it. Keep your head up. Keep building quietly until the day your success speaks so loudly it silences every doubt. They finally apologized weeks later. I forgave them, but this time on my terms, and that made all the difference. So tell me, have you ever had to rise above someone who tried to make you feel small? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this one hit home, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and stay with me for more stories that dig deep into the messy, beautiful, human side of life. Take care of yourself out there. May your peace be louder than your past.